So the next thing I want to talk about is comic art. And the reason why I'm talking about comic art is because there is a lot of commonality between comics and animation. Really, there's a lot of the very early animators were comic artists. When you look at like Winsor McKay, who I would say is kind of like the godfather of modern character animation. He did Gertie the dinosaur. Like that's like one of the first like really famous examples. He also did like Nemo and Slumberland and a bunch of other things, like really really old like black and white stuff. But he was a comic artist, and a lot of the early stuff was. And if you look at the early animations, like Popeye, Felix, and stuff, those started out as comic strips, and then they worked their way through. Okay, because there's a lot of drawing the same characters consistently, and the narratives are similar. They're cartoony, right? Uh, so when we talk about comic art, basically it's just a juxtaposition sequential art using basically sort of obvious tropes that allow a story to be told. So what's interesting with comics though versus animation, and to some extent we do this with animation as well, is that you know what just happened, right? You're picturing it in your eye that he ate this sandwich, that it went through. The gap in between is where all of the action happens. This is the part my mind fills. I give you this, and then you fill what happens in between. And you can picture it in your head, right? Sort of just as you were reading words, you can picture the ideas. It's the same idea here. So the real power in comics is what happens in between. But that allows the user to fill that gap, okay? It's one of those things that maybe you don't really necessarily think about, but it's sort of important. For us as animators, we would be taking, this would be one keyframe, this would be another keyframe, and then we would physically blend our frames together. But as you've seen before, when we do like the switch, I might only have these two drawings, and all I'll do is just kind of squash and stretch from this one to this one, and it blends in between. And again, the user will figure out in their mind's eye like what happened. I really highly suggest so, and I've seen this a couple of times. There'll be like a storyboarding class, and I would say the number one book that's used for storyboarding. So if you are interested in storyboarding, is Understanding Comics by Scott McCloud. I only wrote Scott, but it's Scott McCloud. Um, that's the number one book. It's actually the whole thing is a comic book itself. It's like a graphic novel. It's not really a novel, but it's done that whole way. So it was a book that even I could read. So I highly suggest that just in general because it's very interesting if you're just interested in that at all. Anyway, so there's this interesting quote that Charlie Chaplin had said. And one of the things I would highly suggest, I know we just did the lip sync project and it's cool to have audio, but Charlie Chaplin said that sound basically ruined video. I don't remember if it was his quote, but there's another quote where they said, there was never a universal language um, since the Tower of Babel, which is actually like a Bible thing. I don't know if you know what Tower of Babel is. Basically, it was this all the cultures came together and built this giant tower, but then it fell or something, and then I can't remember exactly how it went. I did read it way back when, but basically everybody was able to speak the same language. Obviously, there's different languages depending on what country you go to and what area of a country and all sorts of things. Sometimes I feel like I talk to people who speak English and I don't know what they're saying, right? But the nice thing is that when we had motion picture, it was universal. You could make a film here, and if it didn't have any dialogue, you could play it in China, you could play it in Africa, Nigeria, you could play it in the Netherlands. You could play it any number of places, and they would all be able to understand it because it was universal, right? That art of pantomime is universal. We all understand that. But the nice thing is when we create animations, because we're not dialogue heavy, we're not based on audio. We can do short films, and even if it does have even if it is in a language, there's so much pantomime built into it because we caricature everything, both the characters but also the motions, that it does become universal. And so there's a real nicety in that when we create our work. So one of the things that you want to think about when you are creating your stuff is iconic abstraction. Basically, you use symbols in order to as a way of shorthand in order to represent things. So the most obvious ones are here. you know what all these things mean, right? So like Windows, Apple, Linux, Android, so on and so forth, right? To the right, down, kissy face, angry. The smiley face is it's a very generic symbol that everybody understands. I love that saving is a 3.5 floppy, which nobody uses anymore. You guys probably never even seen one. Um, I don't have. Oh, so here's another example of using that same sort of idea that we have a canon of accepted ones. So anime or manga have these really this really broad library of these what do you call it? They're not the cheap, but there's the chibis, but these very broad things that everybody understands. So they'll do that weird popping vein thing, or I like the teardrop. I remember there was like Hamtaro, I think it was, and they always had these giant. And I didn't really understand what it was because I'm not really a super big anime. I like some of them, like Attack on Titan or Cowboy Bebop. Like those are phenomenal, but I'm not super big into them. So sometimes when I see them, you're like, I don't understand, but it's a shorthand. We understand what all these are because of the symbolism that is there. Sorry about that. So basically the same idea here, but down here. Also, just realize that we create closure, and we tend to look for patterns and things. So a really good example is pareidolia, however you say it. Basically, it's seeing faces and things where there aren't really necessarily faces. It's also if you have a really strong sense of it, which I do. It's a precursor to what do you call it? Not paranoia, schizophrenia. So just be aware. So one of the things I would have you guys do in class is I would have you like click on this word generator, and then I'd have you try to generate random words. Words. Let's say nouns only. Generate. So it's like, okay, make a symbol that says scarecrow, and then you would it's a good little exercise, and then you would try to be able to draw something to represent that word. Okay. Because if you're able to do that, then you'd be able to apply that skill to any number of things, right? So a lot of what we're trying to do is trying to represent something visually that might be a more complex, concept. But you don't have to do it. It's just that's there if you want to try it.